In the quiet suburb of Elkins Park, Pennsylvania, hidden behind rusting gates and a wall of wild forest, sleeps a stone giant. This is not a government building, nor is it an abandoned museum. It was a private home. Lynnewood Hall, the largest, most opulent, and most tragic Gilded Age mansion still standing on American soil. 110 rooms, 55 bedrooms, a ballroom capable of holding 1,000 guests. It was called the last American Versailles. It was built to become the ancestral seat of a great dynasty that would rule for centuries. But today, its limestone walls are cracking. The wind howls through the interior, and the great dynasty for which it was created was destroyed in a single night. The dynasty that was meant to live here never truly did. Their future was not stolen by a war. It was not lost in a stock market crash. It was destroyed in a single freezing night in the North Atlantic. This is not just a story about a house. It is a story about the brutal, bloody rise of American wealth. It is a story about the staggering arrogance of the Gilded Age. And it is the story of how an iceberg tore the heart out of this palace before it ever truly lived. Welcome to the House of Sorrow. To understand the tragedy of Lynnewood Hall, we must first look at the money that built it. And that money did not come from noble bloodlines or ancient inheritance. It came from the blood of a slaughterhouse. Peter A.B. Widener was born in 1834. He was a creature of Philadelphia's working class. He grew up in a city that was loud, dirty, and exploding with industry. He was not an aristocrat. He was a butcher. In the 1850s, young Peter stood in the chaotic stalls of the city markets, a heavy cleaver in his hand, his apron stained red. He was a big man, loud and charismatic. He knew how to talk to anyone, from the poorest dock worker to the wealthiest merchant buying a Sunday roast. He had a sharp wit and an even sharper eye for opportunity. He didn't just see meat, he saw leverage. When the American Civil War broke out in 1861, the nation descended into chaos. The Union Army flooded into Pennsylvania. Thousands of soldiers needed to be fed, and they needed to be fed fast. Where others saw fear and uncertainty, Peter Widener saw profit. He used his charm and his connections to secure a government contract to supply mutton, sheep meat, to all Union troops stationed within a 10-mile radius of Philadelphia. It was a messy, grueling business. It meant sourcing livestock, slaughtering it, and moving it before it spoiled. But Peter was relentless. By the time the war ended in 1865, the butcher had saved $50,000. In today's money, that was the seed of a fortune. But Peter Widener was smart. He knew that meat spoils. He knew that war contracts end. He wanted an empire that would last forever. He looked at Philadelphia. He saw a city that was expanding outward, eating up the countryside. He saw factories opening miles away from where the workers lived. He realized that the most valuable commodity wasn't food. It was movement. He took his war profits and gambled everything on horse-drawn streetcars. It was a dirty, competitive game. Streetcar lines were fighting for territory, bribing city officials for the rights to lay tracks on the best streets. But Widener wasn't just a businessman. He was a political genius. He realized that to control the rails, he had to control the city hall. He climbed the ladder of Philadelphia's corrupt political machine. He became city treasurer. Critics called him a manipulator. They called him a robber baron. But no one could stop him. He used his political power to crush his rivals. He bought up competing streetcar lines, one by one, merging them into a single, unstoppable monopoly, the Philadelphia Traction Company. When electricity arrived, Widener was the first to adapt. He replaced the slow horses with fast electric trolleys. He partnered with his friend William Elkins and together they expanded their octopus-like reach to New York, Chicago, Pittsburgh, and Baltimore. Imagine the scale of this wealth. In the late 19th century, every time a factory worker in America's biggest cities paid a nickel to get to work, a fraction of that coin traveled all the way back to Philadelphia, into Peter Widener's pocket. It was a river of nickels that never ran dry. By 1900, the butcher was gone. In his place stood a titan of industry, a man who sat on the boards of U.S. Steel and Standard Oil. His net worth was estimated at $100 million. He had more money than he could spend in 100 lifetimes. He had the power of a king. Now, he needed a castle. But immense wealth often demands a blood price. In the late 1890s, tragedy struck the Widener family. Peter's beloved wife, Hannah, died suddenly aboard the family yacht off the coast of Maine. Peter was devastated. The city house in Philadelphia, where they had lived together, became unbearable to him. It was full of ghosts. He decided to leave the city. He wanted to build something new in the countryside of Elkins Park, something that would mark a new beginning, a home that would house not just him, but his entire legacy, his son George, his daughter-in-law Eleanor, and his beloved grandson Harry. He hired the brilliant young architect Horace Trumbauer. Widener's instructions were simple, yet terrifying in their ambition. Build me a home that rivals the palaces of Europe. Build me a home that will stand for eternity. But there was another reason for the scale of the house. The former butcher had developed an obsession. He had become one of the world's greatest collectors of art. Widener was buying up the cultural heritage of the old world. He owned Rembrandts, Raphaels, Van Dycks, Turners, El Grecos. He bought Chinese porcelain, French tapestries, and Renaissance sculptures. He didn't just need a living room, he needed a gallery. He needed a museum. Construction began in 1897. It was an undertaking of biblical proportions. Hundreds of stonemasons were brought in. Endless tons of limestone were shipped by rail from Indiana. The house was built in the neoclassical revival style, shaped like a giant T. The main block was the residence. The long rear wing was the art gallery. Inside, the luxury was suffocating. The great hall featured a staircase that seemed to float on air, leading up to a second-floor balcony. The ballroom was large enough to host the entire Philadelphia society, with walls covered in gold leaf. There was a reception room lined with French oak paneling imported from a European castle. In the basement, hidden from view, lay the organs of the beast. A private electrical power plant, an ice-making machine, a commercial bakery, a carpentry shop, and a sprawling indoor swimming pool. To keep this machine running, Widener employed an army. 100 full-time servants lived on the property. 60 gardeners manicured the 400 acres of French-style gardens. 37 house staff polished the marble floors and silver every single day. It was a self-contained city, a golden cage. When Peter moved in around 1900, the house was perfect. The paint was fresh, the marble gleamed. But it was quiet. Without Hannah, the house felt empty. Peter walked the long, echoey corridors alone, surrounded by the painted eyes of Renaissance aristocrats. He realized that the house was too big for one man. His hope for the future, the only thing that gave this palace meaning, was his bloodline. His son, George, and his grandson, Harry. The Widener dynasty seemed secure. George Widener, Peter's eldest son, was the perfect heir. He was a capable man, forged in his father's image but polished by education. He had taken over the management of the massive transit empire. He was serious, reliable, a man of business who commanded respect in every boardroom in America. He lived in Lynnewood Hall with his wife Eleanor, preparing to one day become the master of the house. But the heart of the family, the favorite of old Peter, was the grandson, Harry Elkins Widener. Harry was 27 years old in 1912. He was the heir apparent to one of the largest fortunes in the world. But Harry was different. He didn't care for the noise of streetcars. He had no interest in stock markets or political deals. He was a gentle soul, a scholar with soft hands and thick glasses. Harry was a bibliophile, a lover of books. And not just any books. Harry hunted for the rarest, most exquisite first editions in history. He spent his allowance traveling the world, scouring dusty shops in London and Paris. He had a photographic memory. It was said he could read a page once and recite it back perfectly years later. His dream was simple but grand: to build a library wing at Lynnewood Hall that would be the envy of Harvard, Oxford, and Cambridge. He wanted to turn his grandfather's palace into a temple of knowledge. In the spring of 1912, the family traveled to London. George was there on business. The Wideners had invested in the construction of the new Ritz-Carlton Hotel in Philadelphia, and George needed to hire a French head chef. Harry, as always, was there for the books. He spent his days at Bernard Quaritch's famous bookshop on Grafton Street. And there, he found a treasure. It was a rare, small volume of essays by the philosopher Francis Bacon, printed in 1598. It was a gem that few collectors had ever seen. Harry held it in his hands, trembling with excitement. He bought it immediately. Before leaving London, Harry showed the book to his friend, the bookseller. He patted his tuxedo pocket and said a phrase that would haunt his family for a century. He said, "I think I'll put this little book in my pocket. It fits perfectly. If the ship goes down, the bacon goes with me." It was a dark joke, a throwaway line spoken by a young man who felt invincible. After all, why would he worry? The Wideners were booking passage on the safest ship ever built. They chose the maiden voyage of the White Star Line's new flagship, the Titanic. Because of their immense wealth, the Wideners were the unofficial royalty of the ship. They occupied the most expensive suites on sea deck. The cost of their ticket would be over $100,000 in today's money. On the evening of April 14th, the Wideners hosted a dinner party in the ship's exclusive à la carte restaurant. They dined with Captain Edward Smith himself. It was a night of glamour. The women wore silk and diamonds. The men smoked expensive cigars. They drank champagne. They toasted to the future of Lynnewood Hall. They toasted to Harry's new book. Around 9 p.m., Captain Smith excused himself to go to the bridge. The Wideners lingered, enjoying the music, feeling the gentle vibration of the massive engines beneath them. Less than 3 hours later, that vibration would stop. And the master of Lynnewood Hall, old Peter Widener, was thousands of miles away in his limestone palace, asleep in his bed, unaware that his entire world was about to be extinguished by ice. At 11:40 p.m., the illusion of safety shattered. A faint shudder ran through the massive steel frame of the Titanic. It wasn't a violent crash, not for the passengers in first class. It felt more like the ship had rolled over 1,000 marbles. In the smoking room, George and Harry Widener likely barely paused their conversation. They were on the unsinkable ship. What was there to fear? But deep below the waterline, the Atlantic Ocean was already pouring in. Within 20 minutes, Captain Smith ordered the lifeboats uncovered. The stewards began knocking on doors. The Wideners made their way to the boat deck. The air was freezing. The sky was a canopy of brilliant, indifferent stars. Even then, there was no panic in George Widener. He was a titan of industry. He was used to controlling every aspect of his world. He believed this was just an inconvenience. He guided his wife, Eleanor, and her maid to lifeboat number 4. The boat was being lowered. The gap between the deck and the freezing water was terrifying. Survivors later recalled George's demeanor. He leaned over the rail, his voice calm and steady. He called out to his wife, "We'll join you in the next boat, Eleanor. Don't worry. This is just a formality." He truly believed it. Or perhaps he just wanted her to believe it. Then came the moment that defined the legacy of the family. Second Officer Lightoller was manning the lifeboat. He saw the Widners standing by the rail. He recognized their status. He knew who they were. There were empty seats in the boat. Lightoller looked at young Harry, 27 years old, clutching his rare book in his pocket. "Step in, sir," the officer said. "There is room for you." It was a choice between life and death. A choice made in a split second. Harry looked at the officer. Then he looked at his father, George, who was 50 years old and would not be offered a seat. Harry shook his head. "I think I'll stick with father," he said quietly. "I won't go before the older men." The lifeboat lowered into the black abyss. Eleanor looked up, watching her husband and son waving from the rail. They were smoking cigars, standing side by side, small glowing dots in the darkness. That was the last time she ever saw them. At 2:20 a.m., the Titanic broke apart and vanished. Harry Elkins Widener, the gentle bibliophile, went into the freezing water with the future of Lynnewood Hall in his pocket. George Widener, the heir to the empire, disappeared into the deep. Neither body was ever recovered. The Atlantic Ocean claimed the king and the prince. And back in Pennsylvania, the limestone palace was waiting for masters who would never return. The news traveled over the telegraph wires like lightning. Inside Lynnewood Hall, old Peter Widener received the message. The butcher-turned-king collapsed. He locked himself in the library. For days he refused to eat. He sat by the window, staring down the long driveway, waiting for a car that would never arrive. Only Eleanor returned. She walked through the great bronze doors alone, a widow and a grieving mother. The house, which had been built to celebrate the rise of the dynasty, instantly became a mausoleum. The silence in the 110 rooms became heavy, suffocating. Peter Widener spent the last 3 years of his life wandering the halls of his creation. He was surrounded by his Rembrandts and his Raphaels, but they brought him no joy. What good is a palace if you have no one to leave it to? He died in his bed at Lynnewood Hall in 1915. The official cause of death was old age. But the servants whispered the truth. He died of a broken heart. In her grief, Eleanor did not build a library at Lynnewood Hall as Harry had planned. Instead, she donated millions to Harvard University. She built the massive Harry Elkins Widener Memorial Library in his honor. Legend says she added a condition to the donation. Harvard students must pass a swimming test to graduate, so that no young man would ever drown as helplessness as her son. The books that were meant for Lynnewood Hall went to Harvard. The soul of the house was already beginning to leave. The house passed to Peter's younger surviving son, Joseph Widener. For a brief moment, it seemed like Lynnewood Hall might survive. Joseph was determined to keep the lights on. The 1920s arrived, the Jazz Age, the era of the Great Gatsby. For a decade, Lynnewood Hall became the center of Philadelphia society. The ballroom was filled with music. The fountains in the gardens sprayed crystal water into the air. Joseph opened the art gallery to the public, allowing ordinary people to walk in and stare at the masterpieces. But underneath the glamour, the house was dying. It was a dinosaur in a modern world. The cost of running Lynnewood Hall was astronomical. It burned tons of coal every single day just to keep the dampness out of the limestone walls. The staff of 100 servants required salaries, food, and housing. And then came the crash. The Great Depression of 1929 devastated the American economy. Even the Widener fortune took a hit. But the real killer was taxes. The government introduced new property and inheritance taxes that targeted the ultra-rich. Lynnewood Hall went from being an asset to being a liability. It was a white elephant, too big to live in, too expensive to sell, too beautiful to destroy. Joseph Widener died in 1943. With him died the last will to keep the palace alive. The family looked at the ledger. They looked at the empty rooms, and they made a cold calculation. It was time to leave. 1944 marked the end of the Gilded Age in Elkins Park. The Widener family moved out. They locked the doors and walked away. But before they left, they stripped the house of its soul. The art collection, one of the greatest in the world, was donated to the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. The Rembrandts were packed into crates. The Raphaels were taken down from the silk-covered walls. Lynnewood Hall was left a hollow shell. The estate was put on the market. But who buys a 110-room palace in the 1940s? No one. Finally, in 1952, a buyer appeared. But it wasn't a billionaire. It was a religious figure. Dr. Carl McIntyre bought the estate for a mere $130,000. He turned the mansion into a religious seminary. This began the darkest chapter in the home's history. It was the era of cannibalism. The seminary had no money to maintain a building of this magnitude. The roof began to leak. The pipes burst. To pay the bills, the new owners began to sell the house, piece by piece. They didn't just sell the furniture. They ripped the French walnut paneling off the walls of the reception room. They pried the marble mantels from the fireplaces. They sold the bronze garden statues. They even sold the landscape itself, selling off hundreds of acres of the gardens for developers to build cheap housing. Lynnewood Hall was eating itself to stay alive. By the 1990s, the seminary was bankrupt. The students left. The doors were chained shut. The house was abandoned to the raccoons, the vandals, and the slow, relentless march of decay. For 30 years, Lynnewood Hall stood as a ghost. It became a legend for local teenagers who dared each other to sneak past the fences. It became a holy grail for urban explorers who captured haunting images of the grand staircase covered in debris. The roof failed. Water poured through the floors, rotting the structure from the inside out. Experts said it was doomed. They said it was too big to save. But history has a way of surprising us. In 2023, the improbable happened. A non-profit organization, the Lynnewood Hall Preservation Foundation, purchased the estate. They didn't buy it to tear it down. They bought it to save it. Volunteers began to clear the jungle of vines. Engineers began to patch the roof. For the first time in nearly a century, there is hope. The plan is to open Lynnewood Hall to the public, to turn it into a cultural center, a museum, a place of education, to finally let the world see what lies behind the iron gates. Lynnewood Hall was built by a butcher who wanted to be a king. It was emptied by an iceberg that didn't care about money. It was ravaged by time and neglect. But it is still standing. It stands as a monument to the ambition of America. It stands as a memorial to the young man who gave up his seat on a lifeboat. And perhaps, after 100 years of silence, the stone giant is finally ready to wake up. Some houses are too big to live in. But maybe, just maybe, this one is too beautiful to die.